225 denarii. That was the annual pay of a Roman legionary under Augustus, guaranteed by the state, recorded in the ledgers, paid out 3 times a year like clockwork. On paper, it was a respectable wage, enough to live on, enough to plan a future around. In practice, by the time a legionary actually held his share in his hand, somewhere between a third and 2/3 of it had already disappeared. Not stolen, not skimmed off in some corrupt side deal. Deducted openly in full view of the unit's own accounts, for grain rations, for replacement boots, for a new tunic when the old one wore through, and for a contribution to a burial fund that would see him buried with dignity if the next campaign went badly. It was, when you look closely at the mechanics, one of the most efficient closed-loop economies the ancient world ever built. The state paid you, and then the state quietly took most of it back, in exchange for the things you needed to keep serving. That system worked for a simple reason. Rome controlled the supply chain of a soldier's daily needs, and a soldier had nowhere else to buy them. Grain, boots, and armor could, in theory, be sourced somewhere else if you were willing to desert, bribe a quartermaster, or take your chances outside the camp. The friction was high, but the option existed. That's what kept this from being a perfect trap. There was always technically an exit. So here's the actual question behind this video. Not, did this happen? It did, and the numbers are well documented. The real question is, what happens if you take that exact architecture and remove the one thing that made it survivable, the existence of an outside option? What happens when the thing being deducted isn't grain, but the air in your lungs? Before we go further, one thing needs to be said clearly. Nothing in this video is a report on a real company, a real industry, or a real practice happening today. This is not journalism. What follows is a thought experiment built by taking a documented historical payroll system and pushing its internal logic to its most extreme, most literal conclusion. Think of it less as a headline and more as a stress test. If a Roman quartermaster from 2,000 years ago were somehow hired to design payroll for an off-world mining operation, what would he build, and how far could the same math be pushed? Call it the oxygen deduction. Let's sit with the Roman system for a minute first, because it's the entire foundation for what comes later. Under Augustus, the base pay for a legionary, the stipendium, was fixed at 225 denarii a year. Domitian later raised it to 300, and by the reign of Septimius Severus, it had climbed further still. But the mechanics stayed the same the whole way through. The state paid gross wages, and the state immediately clawed a large share of it straight back out. The grain ration, called the frumentum, was the biggest line item. Soldiers weren't handed free food. The cost of it was charged against their pay. Clothing, called vestus, worked the same way. Tunics, cloaks, and the famous hobnailed boots called caligae all had to be replaced periodically, and the replacement cost came out of the soldier's account, not the empire's. Weapons and armor maintenance was billed the same way. And then there was the contribution to what we'd now call a burial club, a pooled fund that guaranteed a proper funeral if a soldier died in service, because in Roman religious life, an unburied corpse wasn't just sad, it was considered a genuine spiritual catastrophe. Add all of that together, and the surviving pay record suggests the average legionary kept somewhere around a third of his nominal pay as real spendable cash. The rest never actually left the institution. It was paid out on one line of the ledger and recovered on another, which meant the legion functioned less like an employer writing a paycheck and more like a closed circuit, where money moved in a loop, and the soldier's true compensation was mostly non-cash: shelter, food, equipment, and the promise of land or a lump sum after 25 years of service, assuming he survived that long. This wasn't a scam. For an organization managing tens of thousands of men across multiple provinces, Centralizing procurement of food and equipment was honestly a well-engineered logistics system, but it had a side effect that mattered enormously. It made every soldier financially dependent on the institution for the basics of survival, which meant loyalty and control became, in part, a function of accounting, not just discipline. Now, push on that idea. The Roman system worked as well as it did because the things being deducted, food, cloth, metal, were still, in principle, available somewhere outside the system. Expensive to get, inconvenient to get, sometimes dangerous to get, but available. That outside option is what separates a harsh employment arrangement from an inescapable one. So imagine, purely as a thought experiment, a future extraction company, one we'll call a Sealed Industrial Array, or SIA for short, running an operation somewhere with no breathable atmosphere of its own. A mining platform on an airless moon, or a sealed deep processing facility, somewhere the entire local economy exists inside a hull. Every single input a human body needs to survive one more shift, air, water, warmth, has to be manufactured, filtered, or shipped in by the company that built the facility. There's no independent oxygen vendor floating outside the airlock. There's no black market for breathable air 100 million miles from anywhere. The company isn't just the employer here. Functionally, it is the atmosphere. Once you accept that premise, the payroll logic writes itself because it's just the Roman system with the friction removed. The SIA pays a nominal wage, let's say, for the sake of a clean example, 3,000 credits per work cycle. Sounds competitive. Sounds like a real paycheck. Then the deductions start, and they look eerily familiar. There's an atmospheric allocation charge, your personal share of the oxygen the facility scrubs and recycles every cycle, the direct descendant of the Roman grain ration, except, unlike grain, you cannot skip a meal and tighten your belt to save on it. There's a thermal and water reclamation charge, since keeping a human body alive in a vacuum-adjacent environment costs energy every hour, on shift or off. There's a habitat module lease, the rough equivalent of Rome's tent and camp fees. There's a hazard gear charge standing in for the Roman armor and weapons line, since suit seals and filters degrade, and someone has to pay to replace them. And finally, there's an emergency extraction bond, a fund that guarantees a worker's body gets recovered and shipped home instead of simply vented. The exact functional descendant of the Roman burial club, right down to the cultural logic behind it. Nobody wants to die anonymously in a place with no ground to be buried in. Run the math the way you'd run it for a legionary. And an SIA worker might see something like this: 3,000 credits gross. And by the time atmosphere, water, thermal, habitat, gear, and the extraction bond are all deducted, disposable pay lands somewhere around 400 to 500 credits. That's roughly 15% take home, which sounds brutal until you remember the Roman legionary, by most estimates, kept around a third. This hypothetical operation is deducting harder than Rome ever managed to. And the reason isn't cruelty for its own sake. It's economics. Rome was pricing grain, a good with substitutes, even bad ones. The SIA is pricing oxygen, a good with none. In a normal market, price gets disciplined by the buyer's ability to walk away and buy from someone else. Take that ability away completely, and the seller, in this case the employer, can push the price of survival right up to the edge of what a person can physically and psychologically endure, and not one credit further, because a dead worker produces nothing. That ceiling isn't kindness. It's simply the point where the math stops working in the company's favor. Here's where the Roman parallel becomes almost exact again. What actually happens to that remaining 400 or 500 credits of disposable pay? In a system like this, there's rarely an outside economy to spend it in. There's a commissary run by the company selling comfort items, better food, entertainment credits, contact time with family back home, all priced in the same currency the company already controls both ends of. That structure should sound familiar because it's the same one used by 19th century mining company towns, where workers were paid partly in scrip that was only redeemable at the company store. So, wages that left the payroll office on Monday were often back in company hands by Friday. Historians have a name for this pattern wherever it shows up, from coal valleys to mining camps to colonial plantation economies. A closed-loop wage system, where the employer is simultaneously your source of income and the only available destination for that income, meaning the wage never really leaves the balance sheet. It just does a lap. The SIA version of this trick has one upgrade over the company town. In a company town, a worker could at real cost walk out and start over somewhere else. In a sealed facility with no outside air, walking out isn't an option. It's a death sentence, which means the single most important form of leverage any worker has in any Nagadat. Economists have a term for a market, with exactly one buyer controlling something everyone needs: monopsony. Add in the fact that the good being sold back to the worker, breathable air, has what's called perfectly inelastic demand, meaning a person will pay literally anything for it because the alternative is death, and you get one of the purest extraction environments imaginable on a spreadsheet. A Roman quartermaster, looking at his own grain deduction line from 2,000 years in the past, would probably recognize the logic instantly, and maybe admire the efficiency, even while wincing at how far it had been pushed. The Roman system, brutal as it could be, still had a natural ceiling, because soldiers could desert, could mutiny, could occasionally force better terms through sheer numbers, and Roman history is full of exactly that: a system built around a resource with zero substitutes and zero outside supply removes that ceiling almost entirely. The only real constraint left is the same one the SIA math already respects: keep the worker alive enough to keep extracting value tomorrow. None of this is a prediction, and it isn't a claim about any company that exists right now. It's an extrapolation. What if we kept turning a dial we already know is real? The Roman legion shows us the dial exists, documented in pay records nearly 2,000 years old. The oxygen deduction just asks how far that same dial could theoretically turn if every remaining bit of friction between an employer and the necessities of a human life were removed. If you want the real historical numbers this whole video was built on, the actual Roman legion payroll breakdown, denarii, deductions, and all, is already on this channel, and it's worth watching alongside this one. If speculative economics like this is the kind of rabbit hole you enjoy, subscribe, because there are plenty more systems worth pushing to their logical extreme. What's the next one you'd want to see taken apart like this? Drop it in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.